I was working the front desk at a Sydney hostel when an American family walked in, looking absolutely destroyed. The dad marched straight up to me and said, "We need to file a complaint. Your country's weather app is completely broken." I blinked at him. He pulled out his phone and showed me. "See? It says it's 25 degrees outside. We've been freezing all morning in our shorts and t-shirts because clearly it's not 25 degrees Fahrenheit out there." I had to explain that Australia uses Celsius. 25 Celsius is about 77 Fahrenheit. Perfect beach weather. They'd been complaining about the cold in ideal summer conditions. His wife just stared at me and said, "Why would you do that to temperature?" If you're already realizing how wild these moments get, this is exactly the kind of cross-culture chaos I break down every week. Most people just scroll past stories like this. You're the kind who actually gets the joke. Stick around, subscribe, so you don't miss the next one. My coworker told me about another guest who asked where they could catch the subway to Uluru. For context, Uluru is in the middle of the Australian outback. It's about 1,500 kilometers from any major city. There is no subway. There's barely a road. When my coworker explained this, the American said, "Well, how do people get to work then?" She thought Uluru was a suburb of Sydney. She'd seen it in photos and assumed it was just a quick commute away. My coworker had to pull up a map and show her that Australia is roughly the same size as the continental United States. The woman looked genuinely shocked and said, "But you only have like 3 cities." Another time, a guy asked me what time the wildlife show started. I didn't know what he meant. He explained that he'd booked a trip to Australia specifically to see kangaroos, koalas, and other animals. He thought there was a scheduled time when they all came out, like a zoo performance. I told him the animals were just out there living their lives in the wild. He looked confused and asked, "So how do I know when to watch them?" I suggested he could visit an actual wildlife sanctuary or national park. He seemed disappointed and said he thought the whole country was basically one big zoo where animals performed on a schedule. Then there was the woman who asked if she needed her passport to visit Tasmania. She thought Tasmania was a separate country. When I explained it's an Australian state, she argued with me. She said, "But it's an island, so it has to be its own country. That's how islands work." I told her by that logic, Hawaii would be its own country too. She paused and said, "Wait, isn't it?" I just handed her a brochure and suggested she Google Australian geography before her trip. These weren't isolated incidents. Every single week brought new surprises. Americans struggling with basic cultural norms, geography, measurements, and assumptions about how Australia works. And honestly, watching it unfold was both exhausting and entertaining. So let me walk you through some of the most memorable moments when Americans completely failed to understand Australian culture. I was working at a cafe in Melbourne when an American couple sat down and studied the menu for 10 minutes. Finally, the husband called me over and asked what a flat white was. I explained it's an espresso-based coffee drink with microfoam milk. He squinted at me and said, "So it's a latte?" I told him it's similar but different in milk texture and ratio. He shook his head and said, "You Australians just make up names for normal things." Then he ordered a regular coffee. I asked him to clarify what he meant by regular. He said, "You know, just normal drip coffee in a big cup." We don't really do drip coffee in most Australian cafes. I offered him a long black or Americano. He got frustrated and said, "Why is ordering coffee so complicated here?" My friend worked at a beachside restaurant on the Gold Coast. An American family came in and ordered dinner. When the bill arrived, they sat there waiting and waiting. After 20 minutes, they flagged down my friend and asked why the service was so terrible. She asked what they needed. They said, "We're waiting for our server to come back so we can pay and leave." She told them they could just walk up to the counter and pay whenever they were ready. The dad looked offended and said, "That's not how restaurants work. The server brings the check and you pay at the table." My friend explained that in Australia, you usually pay at the counter unless it's a fancy establishment. The mom muttered, "How are we supposed to know these random rules?" Another American asked me if Vegemite was supposed to taste like that, or if ours had gone bad. I asked how much she'd used. She said she'd made Vegemite toast the way she makes peanut butter toast back home, meaning she'd slathered it on thick. I explained you only use a tiny scrape of Vegemite with butter. She looked horrified and said, "Why would you sell something that requires instructions? Food should be obvious." I told her every culture has unique foods with specific preparation methods. She just said Vegemite was a prank Australians played on tourists. I was at a pub quiz night in Brisbane when a group of American tourists joined a table. One of the rounds was about Australian slang. The host asked, "What does arvo mean?" The Americans guessed highway, argument, and armadillo. It means afternoon. When the host revealed the answer, one of them said, "That doesn't even make sense. There's no V sound in afternoon." The table of Aussies next to them just laughed. Later, the host asked what bogan means. The Americans guessed it was a type of sandwich. It's slang for someone uncultured or unsophisticated. When they got that wrong too, one of them said, "Australian English is basically a different language. You can't expect us to know this stuff." My co-worker at the hostel told me about an American who complained that Australians were rude because no one said "you're welcome" when he thanked them. In Australia, the common response to "thank you" is "no worries" or "no drama." He interpreted this as people dismissing his gratitude. He actually wrote a review saying Australians were cold and unfriendly. My coworker tried to explain it's just a cultural difference in polite phrases, but he insisted that "you're welcome" was the only correct response. Then there was the guy who got upset at a barbecue because someone called him mate. He thought it was condescending. In Australia, mate is universal. It's friendly, neutral, casual. You call your best friend mate. You call a stranger mate. You call the Prime Minister mate if you bump into him. This American thought everyone was mocking him by refusing to use his actual name. He kept saying, "My name is Derek. Just call me Derek." People tried to explain that mate is a term of endearment and inclusion, but he took it personally the entire trip. I witnessed an American woman at a market ask for a shrimp on the Barbie. The vendor looked confused. Australians call them prawns, not shrimp. The woman insisted she'd seen it in movies and commercials. The vendor told her that phrase was from an old American tourism ad and doesn't reflect how Australians actually speak. She accused him of lying to make fun of tourists. She said, "I know what I saw. You people say shrimp on the Barbie." The vendor just sighed and sold her prawns. One American asked me why Australians celebrate Thanksgiving in November when it's spring here, not fall. I told her we don't celebrate Thanksgiving at all. It's an American holiday. She looked shocked and said, "But it's Thanksgiving. Everyone celebrates Thanksgiving." I explained that every country has its own national holidays based on their own history. She said that didn't make sense because Thanksgiving was about being grateful, which is universal. I just agreed and moved on. You can't win every battle. Another guy complained that Australian pharmacies didn't sell groceries. He wanted to buy milk, chips, and cold medicine in one place. I explained that pharmacies here focus on medications and health products. For groceries, you go to a supermarket. He said, "In America, pharmacies sell everything. It's way more efficient." I told him we just organize our stores differently. He called it backwards and inconvenient. I suggested he walk 2 blocks to the Woolworths. He asked what that was. I said it's our major supermarket chain. He said, "Why not just call it a grocery store like normal people?" I was working at a car rental company in Perth when an American asked for a vehicle with the steering wheel on the correct side. I asked what he meant. He said, "You know, the left side, the normal side." I explained that in Australia, we drive on the left side of the road, so the steering wheel is on the right side of the car. He stared at me and said, "That's illegal." I assured him it's completely legal and standard here. He insisted it violated international driving laws. I pulled up the rental agreement and showed him the section about left-side driving. He reluctantly accepted it, but muttered that Australia was doing it wrong. My friend is a bus driver in Sydney. An American tourist got on and asked how many miles until the next stop. My friend said it was about 3 kilometers. The American said, "I don't know what that means. Can you convert it to real measurements?" My friend told him a kilometer is roughly 0.6 miles. The guy sighed and said, "Why doesn't Australia just use the normal system?" My friend replied, "We do. The metric system is used by almost every country on Earth." The American said, "But not the important ones." My friend just kept driving. Another American asked me how to get from Sydney to Melbourne. I said you could fly, drive, or take a train. She asked how long the drive was. I said about 9 hours, depending on traffic and stops. She looked horrified and said, "That's longer than crossing multiple states back home. Why don't you have high-speed trains connecting your cities?" I explained Australia is huge and sparsely populated, so infrastructure is different. She said, "That's not an excuse. You should fix that." I told her we're working with what we have. She just seemed personally offended by Australian geography. I was at the airport when an American family arrived for a domestic flight to Cairns. They were confused about why they needed to go through security. The dad said, "It's a domestic flight. You don't do security for domestic flights." I told him that yes, we absolutely do security screening for all flights in Australia. He argued that in America, domestic security was simpler and faster. I said, "Okay, but you're in Australia now." He acted like this was a massive inconvenience designed specifically to annoy him. One guy asked me where the train to Bali was. I told him Bali is in Indonesia. It's a different country. You'd need to fly there. He insisted he'd read about a train connection between Australia and Bali. I pulled up a map and showed him the ocean separating the two. He said, "Can't you just build a bridge?" I explained that the distance is over 2,500 kilometers of open ocean. Building a bridge isn't feasible. He said, "Europe has tunnels underwater. You could do the same thing." I told him the scale was completely different. He walked away saying Australia lacked ambition. My co-worker dealt with an American who was angry about daylight saving time. He said his phone changed time zones automatically, and now all his alarms were wrong. She explained that different states in Australia observe daylight saving at different times, and some don't observe it at all. He said, "That's the dumbest system I've ever heard. Just pick one and stick with it." She told him it's based on geography and agricultural needs. He said, "America manages time zones just fine without this chaos." She pointed out that America also has states that don't observe daylight saving. He ignored that and kept complaining. An American asked me why Sydney wasn't the capital of Australia. I said because Canberra is the capital. He said, "But Sydney is bigger and more famous. That doesn't make sense." I explained that Canberra was chosen as a compromise between Sydney and Melbourne. He said, "That's stupid. You should have just picked the biggest city." I told him that's not how it works. He said, "In America, Washington, D.C. is the capital, and it makes sense." I didn't bother pointing out that D.C. isn't the biggest city in America either. Then there was the woman who asked how to drive to New Zealand. I told her New Zealand is a separate country across the ocean. "You have to fly or take a boat," she said, "but it's right there on the map next to Australia." I explained that maps aren't to scale, and New Zealand is about 2,000 kilometers away across the Tasman Sea. She said, "Why isn't there a bridge?" I said, "Because it's an ocean." She said, "Well, that's poor planning." I was helping an American plan a road trip from Sydney to Darwin. I told him it's about 3,900 kilometers and would take at least 4 days of solid driving. He said, "That's insane. Your country is too big." I told him Australia is roughly the same size as the continental United States. He didn't believe me. I pulled up a size comparison map. He stared at it and said, "But you have way fewer people. Where is everyone?" I said, "Most of the population lives on the coasts." He said, "You should fill in the middle." I told him the middle is mostly desert. He said, "Then why keep it?" Another American complained that Australian addresses didn't make sense. She said, "You write the street number before the street name, then the suburb, then the city, then the state. It's backwards." I told her that's just how addresses are formatted here. She said, "But in America, we do it the right way." I asked what made the American way right. She said, "Because that's how I learned it." I just nodded and moved on. One guy asked me why Australians call gasoline petrol. He said, "It's gasoline. That's what it's called. Why make up a different word?" I explained that petrol comes from petroleum and is used in most English-speaking countries outside America. He said, "But gasoline is the correct term." I said both are correct, depending on where you are. He disagreed. I was working at a wildlife park near Cairns when an American tourist asked if the kangaroos were trained. I said no. They're wild animals that happen to be comfortable around humans in this controlled environment. She said, "But they're just sitting there. Don't they perform tricks or anything?" I explained they're not circus animals. They're just living their lives. She seemed disappointed and asked if she could request a specific trick. I said no. She asked to speak to the kangaroo trainer. I told her there wasn't one. She left a bad review saying the kangaroos were lazy. My friend is a lifeguard at Bondi Beach. An American asked him why there were flags planted in the sand. He explained those mark the safe swimming area patrolled by lifeguards. Swimming outside the flags is dangerous due to rips and currents. The American said, "I'm a strong swimmer. I don't need flags telling me where to swim." My friend warned him about rip currents and how they can pull even experienced swimmers out to sea. The guy waved him off and swam outside the flags. 10 minutes later, my friend had to rescue him from a rip. The American said it was the ocean's fault for being unpredictable. Another American asked me if drop bears were real. I told her no, drop bears are a joke Australians tell tourists. They're fictional creatures supposedly like koalas, but aggressive and drop from trees to attack people. She looked relieved and said, "Thank God. I was genuinely scared." Then she asked if the spiders were as dangerous as people say. I told her Australia does have some venomous spiders, but deaths are extremely rare due to anti-venom and medical care. She said, "So I should be worried." I said no, just be aware and don't stick your hands in dark places. She spent her entire trip paranoid about spiders that never appeared. I witnessed an American family arrive in Darwin during wet season. They were shocked by the humidity and heat. The dad said, "Your weather report said it was 30 degrees. That's not hot." I explained that's 30 Celsius, which is 86 Fahrenheit. And with humidity, it feels much hotter. He said, "You keep using Celsius like it means something. Just use Fahrenheit." I told him Australia uses metric measurements, including Celsius. He said, "That's making things harder for tourists." I suggested he download a conversion app. He said he shouldn't have to. My co-worker at the hostel told me about an American who asked if it was safe to drink tap water in Australia. She said yes, Australian tap water is perfectly safe and clean. He didn't believe her. He said, "I've traveled enough to know you can't trust tap water in foreign countries." She explained Australia has high water quality standards. He insisted on buying bottled water for his entire trip. He spent a fortune on something he could have gotten free from the tap. Then there was the guy who wanted to take a selfie with a wild crocodile. I was working at a tour company in the Northern Territory. He asked where he could find crocodiles just hanging out. I told him crocodiles are extremely dangerous, and you should never approach them in the wild. He said, "Come on, they're not that bad. I've seen them on TV." I explained that saltwater crocodiles are aggressive predators responsible for fatal attacks. He said, "I'll be careful." I refused to tell him locations. He accused me of being overprotective. An American woman asked me why Australians don't have screens on their windows. I told her most Australian homes do have fly screens. She said, Not the place I'm staying. I asked where she was staying. She was at a modern apartment in the city. I explained that some newer buildings use air conditioning and keep windows closed instead of screens. She said, "That's wasteful. Just use screens and open the windows." I told her different climates and building designs require different solutions. She insisted Australia was doing it wrong. I was at a cafe when an American asked the barista for iced coffee. The barista made him an Australian-style iced coffee, which includes ice cream and is more like a dessert drink. The American took one sip and said, "This isn't iced coffee. This is a milkshake." The barista explained that's how iced coffee is served in Australia. He said, "No, iced coffee is just cold coffee with ice. This is wrong." The barista offered to make him a cold brew instead. He accepted, but kept muttering about how Australia ruined iced coffee. My friend worked at a pharmacy in Melbourne. An American came in asking for specific medications by brand name. My friend explained those brands weren't available in Australia, but there were equivalent medications with different names. The American insisted the Australian versions weren't the same. My friend showed him the active ingredients were identical. He said, "But it's not the brand I trust. How do I know this will work?" My friend assured him the regulations and standards in Australia are strict. He reluctantly bought the medication but said he'd never trust Australian pharmacies. One American asked me why Australia didn't have tipping culture. I explained that service workers here receive fair wages, so tipping isn't expected or required. He said, "But how do you reward good service?" I told him you can leave a tip if you want, but it's not mandatory. He said, "That removes the incentive for workers to do a good job." I explained that workers do their jobs well because that's their job, not because they're chasing tips. He disagreed and said tipping culture was better. I didn't argue. Another woman complained that Australian toilet stalls had gaps that were too small. She said, "In America, there's a big gap at the bottom and top of stall doors. It's normal." I told her most Australian bathroom stalls have more privacy with smaller gaps or floor-to-ceiling doors. She said, "But that feels claustrophobic. I like knowing there's space." I didn't know what to say to that. She genuinely preferred less privacy in bathrooms. I was wrapping up a shift at the hostel when an American guest approached me with a notebook. He said he'd been documenting all the things Australia does differently from America. He showed me his list. It had over 50 entries. Things like power outlets, light switches, coffee names, slang, measurements, driving rules, food, animals, weather reporting, and more. He said, "I just don't understand why you can't do things the normal way." I asked him what he meant by normal. He said, "The American way. It's standard." I told him that every country has its own systems and culture, and none of them are more correct than others. He shook his head and said, "But if everyone did it the same way, travel would be so much easier." I thought about that conversation for a while. The thing is, travel isn't supposed to be easy in the sense of being identical everywhere. The whole point of traveling is experiencing different cultures, systems, and perspectives. If every country operated exactly like America, there'd be no reason to leave. The confusion, the learning curve, the funny misunderstandings, those are all part of the adventure. But some people don't see it that way. They want the world to be a theme park version of home with slightly different scenery. My manager once told me about an American guest who left a review saying Australia felt like America but harder. He complained about everything from measurements to coffee to plug adapters. At the end of the review, he wrote, "I don't understand why Australia makes simple things complicated. Just adopt American standards and everything would be fine." My manager responded politely, thanking him for his feedback and hoping he'd enjoyed the aspects of his trip that went well. But, privately, she said, "That guy completely missed the point of international travel." The funniest part is that Australians traveling to America experience the exact same confusion in reverse. Fahrenheit makes no sense to us. Your tipping culture is stressful. Your healthcare system is terrifying. Your measurement system feels arbitrary. But we adapt, because that's what you do when you visit a different country. You learn the local way of doing things. You ask questions. You accept that your way isn't the only way. And honestly, most Americans who visit Australia are wonderful. They're curious, respectful, and excited to learn about our culture. They laugh at their own mistakes. They embrace the differences. They try Vegemite properly. They learn to say, "No worries." They understand that crocodiles are genuinely dangerous. They convert Celsius to Fahrenheit without complaining. These stories are about the memorable exceptions, not the rule. But those exceptions give us plenty of material. Every week brings a new story about someone who thought Tasmania was a different country, or tried to drive to New Zealand, or demanded we switch to Fahrenheit for their convenience. And trust me, these stories never stop coming. As long as cultural differences exist, there will always be moments of confusion, frustration, and hilarious misunderstandings. That's just part of sharing our corner of the world with visitors who expected something different.